Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining this, our 6th session of the SAFI UAE webinar series. My name is Alejandro Rios. I'm the Director of the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium at Khalifa University of Science and Technology. And today we have a very interesting session that will look into the regional constraints and opportunities we have here in the UAE for the production of sustainable aviation fuels. We have an amazing set of panelists today. We have people from different companies and different places that will allow us to understand all of these regional constraints and opportunities. And so it'll be a very interesting session. As always, we have to thank our sponsors, and we're happy to have the General Civil Aviation Authority from the UAE, the GCAA. We have Etihad Airways as another one of our sponsors. We have IATA, the International Air Transport Association. We have Emirates Airlines as another one of our sponsors. We have the Boeing Company, and as well, we have Masdar Company, which is Masdar, or the Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company, as our sponsor as well. So with that, I'd like to start the session. We're not going to be reading the bios this time because it takes a significant amount of time, and we have many panelists join us today. So we will start with the presentation from John Hurst. John is the Director of Capacity Procurement for the Emirates Water and Electricity Company, or EWEC, and he will be giving us an overview of what EWEC is, and he's going to be sharing with us his experience in developing many renewable energy and large-scale and electricity and water projects. So, John, please, can you start us off with this, with your presentation? Thank you.
Sure. Hopefully you can all see this.
Not yet, but
not yet?
Not yet.
Try again. Are you on yet? Is it on now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, John. Go ahead.
Excellent. Good. So good afternoon, everybody. As Alejandro say, I'm John Hurst, Director of Capacity Procurement at EWEC. It stands for Emirates Water and Electricity Company.
Sorry, John, I don't want to interrupt, but if you want, you can click on the slideshow presenter so that we have a full screen.
From beginning.
Yeah.
Is that full?
No, that is the presenter's view, but that should be fine.
Okay, I don't know why it's doing that.
You can press F5 in your computer.
Different computer, I think. I think we'll just like this, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Why does that come up? Anyway, sorry. So, as I said, my name's John Hurst from Emirates Water and Electricity Company. Emirates, EWEC was formed in 2018, but it has a history of 20 years of the procurement of power and water projects and immense experience in doing that. I'll go on to the next slide. So our mission is to deliver secure and reliable power and water to the Emirates of Abu Dhabi and most of the Northern Emirates as well. We also act as a good partner for the creation and use of power and water in the UAE. So that's why we're so keen to be participating in this initiative. We promote the efficient and environmental water and power supply, complying with the goals of the United Emirates visions, and we aim to be a leader of change within the energy sector in the United Emirates. So what we do, we first of all have to focus on what the long-term demand for electricity and water is in the region here. And from that, we create our capacity procurement plans. And we deal with all forms of thermal power here, except for coal, and renewable technologies. We have CSP, renewable, one operational 1 gigawatt PV solar project. And one just approaching a 2 gigawatt PV solar project approaching financial close in October of this year. We are also responsible to produce the power and water in the region at the lowest cost available. And maybe you're aware that we announced the winning bidder for the 2 gigawatt project just south of Abu Dhabi in Al Dhafra at a world lowest cost of electricity of 1.35 cents per kilowatt hour. So our role within the UAE, we support the government and the Northern Emirates by trying to reduce the cost of provision of both power and water, but maintaining or increasing the security of that supply. So we're maintaining quality, in other words. And we also are trying to reduce the carbon footprint of power generation by up to 70% by 2050, and the clean energy content by 2050 to be 50%. And we work with many entities in the region and internationally to try and achieve this focus. And as you know, the first nuclear power unit, 1500 megawatts, has just started generating power as from the middle of last month. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides now on how we achieve our low cost of energy, and for that matter, for production of water as well in the region. So the key attractive features of our projects is that we lower the construction risk for the owners of the projects. We always use an independent power project principle, which has been very successful over the last 20 years. For PV solar projects specifically, the modular nature of the projects lower the risk even further. And what we do as EWEC, when we issue the inquiries to bidders to take on 40% share of the project, we ensure that the site parameters are well defined, the interfaces, especially to the grid, etc., are clear. And we also define the optimization processes to ensure that maximum energy will be produced at the lowest cost. Also, to assist those bidders, we enable the projects to be very attractive to international and local lenders in that stable cash flows can be generated, basically because the actual generation is very highly predictable nowadays in terms of how much sun will shine during the day. Another key feature is the strong participation from the Abu Dhabi government. The United Arab Emirates is very politically stable, and of course the government highly credit rated, AA rated. Also, government related entities own 60% of the project company, and for PB2 especially, it's highly strategic because it's off scale. 2 gigawatts is the largest done in a single project execution to get us on our target to achieve 7 gigawatts total of solar PV by 25 and 11 gigawatts by 2030. By launching the process for the 40% share in the project, we attract highly qualified international partners, and we get responses from many of leading global renewable developers and operators, and we select usually between 5 and 7 bidders to participate in the process. So we do a clear and transparent qualification process. We ensure that the construction contract and the contractor are also highly qualified, and they have to build the project on a lump sum fixed price, date certain basis, also guaranteeing performance, and this protects the project from the losses related if the construction contractor does not meet capacity or is delayed for its own fault, of course, or does not meet performance. In addition, PV modules now come with a 30-year warranty, and that is why we are also prepared to offer a 30-year term of the power purchase agreement that we take on with the winning bidder and the local government entities. The power purchase agreement itself has a sound commercial contract structure that has been refined over the last 20 years and adjusted to suit the various technologies that we've dealt with. We've done 12 successfully completed independent power and water projects over the last 20 years. Those projects have required $4 billion in equity and approaching $15 billion in debt. The tariff is always viable without any specific subsidy. i.e., we've not had to use a process that has been done in other regions in the past for feed-in tariff or green supplement. So as I said, the 1.35 cents per kilowatt hour, excuse me, we achieved recently is proof in the pudding. The economic fundamentals are underpinned by this, and even though we're in a difficult situation as COVID, we still have the ability to get these projects to finance close with the lenders. And we've already done that during this difficult time with our 2,400 megawatt combined cycle project in Fujairah, which of course was approaching over $1 billion in project cost. again, just going into a bit more detail on the power purchase agreement itself, the financing strategy we also clearly define. To support the project, we also take the risk in the change of interest rates between the date of bid and an actual financial close. Sometimes that's to our advantage, of course. We also bear the risk of Abu Dhabi government entities' action or inaction. For example, difficulties in obtaining permits. Doesn't happen very often nowadays. Or you know, some of the incidents that have occurred, for instance, in delay in travel or restrictions in travel for COVID, etc., that have been introduced. Force majeure, we also provide protection. And this is both during the construction operational phase of the project. So, for instance, if there's a force, say the overhead line or the connection to the grid, or the grid is lost, the project does not suffer whilst the grid is being repaired. They will get what is termed deemed generation, so they will still receive their revenues. And then the final key positive is that if there is a termination of the project for some unforeseen event, then the payment of that termination amount is guaranteed by the Abu Dhabi government, not just EWEC. So I hope that hopes to demonstrate of how well the United Arab Emirates procures both its power and water, how it wants to focus on the development of clean energy, and how it wants to support initiatives such as SAFI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I think this was very important to hear, specifically all of your experience and all of these very important elements that are needed in order to achieve the prices that you mentioned. I've seen a couple of webinars. Can you
open your microphone?
Can you hear me? Sorry. I've seen a couple of webinars in which there's a lot of skepticism about the prices that are being achieved here. And so we'll have time in the discussion to address these issues. With that, I'd like to continue with the next presentation, which will be by Hassan El-Hujaili. Hassan is the Climate and Sustainability Group Lead for Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia. And he will talk to us about this new, or not new, but a different alternative that the aviation industry is considering in the use of what are being called lower carbon aviation fuels. And so with that, I would give the floor to Hassan. And so please, Hassan, can you please go ahead? Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro, for the introduction. For some reason, my name and your name are the same on the dashboard.
you can change that, but don't worry about it.
Yeah, don't worry about it. And so I'm gonna, as you said, share my screen to provide you with an introduction on the other option, the lower carbon aviation fuel. Let me know, please, when you see my screen.
And so
we can see your screen, but also if you can hit the presentation mode, I think it'd be better.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
I mean, thank you very much, Alejandro, for having me on this panel to discuss the CORSIA lower carbon aviation fuel. I mean, the main objective of this very short introduction would be for me to introduce this alternative, which is also part of the CORSIA regulation. I will basically go through the main slide of this presentation. It's a very short presentation, and it's mainly meant to introduce the lower carbon aviation fuel concept. But before I chip in and introduce what do we mean by lower carbon aviation fuel under CORSIA, I would like to recap for the audience to basically show what does the CORSIA entail. Now, CORSIA is the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. Probably some of the audience has already attended some presentations where this concept has been, or this scheme has been introduced in the past. What I wanted to recall is the options that are available to meet the goals of CORSIA. So if you look at this graph, we can see how the emissions from the international civil aviation industry are projected to grow with time. And what would CORSIA entail? CORSIA as a scheme actually aims to freeze the emissions from international civil aviation from 2020 onwards, as we see here. So to do that, there are different options available under CORSIA. The area highlighted in red is basically the improvements or the emissions reductions that we can achieve by operational improvements. The area that is highlighted in blue reflects the emissions reductions that are projected to be reduced or offset using aircraft technology advancement, as they mean, like the aircraft efficiency, aerodynamics, etc. Now, even with those measures, even with the operational improvements and with the aircraft technology, we can see that there remains a significant amount of emissions, which is highlighted in the green area here, that need to be reduced to meet the CORSIA objective of having basically freeze the CO2 emissions from the industry from 2020 onwards. To do that, we can see these are significant efforts here, and what lies in this green area in the curve is actually what we call the basket of measures under CORSIA. And I will talk in the next slides about the basket of measures. So the core of CORSIA, I mean, we should always remember that the core of CORSIA is basically using carbon offsetting, which is basically through a carbon market, to offset the emissions from the aviation industry. It's not surprising to know that the aviation industry is one of what we categorize as hard to decarbonize sectors, and therefore offsets lies in the core of the CORSIA as being one of the main mechanisms through which we can offset the emissions from the remaining residual emissions from aviation growth, and therefore achieve the CORSIA objective or target. However, of course, there are constraints as to how much offsets we can basically develop for the CORSIA. One of the main obstacles lies in the quality of the offsets. So quality has been always a constraint that needs to be developed or resolved with time. Therefore, the CORSIA provided more flexibility by providing what we call eligible fuels as a drop-in fuels for the aviation industry as a means to reduce the offsetting requirements. So, and that's where the sustainable aviation fuels, the second option, lies. And I think that a lot of the initiative that you guys are discussing today lies on or is around the sustainable aviation fuel concept, which is using conventional biofuels and advanced biofuels, or generally fuels that are produced from renewable energy sources, as a drop-in fuel which would reduce the offsetting requirements under CORSIA for the airline operators. The third option that I am here to basically introduce to you today is the lower carbon aviation fuel, or what we call the LCAF. And the third option is basically, as the icons that we have here suggest, is taking the conventional aviation fuel supply chain and managing the carbon emissions from the supply chain, which includes producing oil, transporting the oil to the refinery, refining the oil to produce the jet fuel, distributing the jet fuel to the market, and of course the combustion of the jet fuel in the aircraft. So all this, what we call the life cycle, is incorporated into the objective of LCAF to meet a specific criteria that qualifies the conventional jet fuel as a lower carbon aviation fuel that can be used as a drop-in fuel to basically reduce the offsetting requirements also for the airline operators. We'll talk more, maybe if I had the chance to talk more about what technologies or what are the technologies in different parts of the supply chain that we actually generally target to be able to reduce the emissions associated with jet fuel production, conventional jet fuel production, and therefore meet the criteria required for the LCAF production. To give you a quick last slide here, final and last, to give you what do we mean by the criteria. One of the main criteria is how do we define lower carbon aviation fuel versus a conventional jet fuel. So here in black, you can see this is the life cycle emissions from the different stages of conventional jet fuel production. The total life cycle emissions over the full life cycle of conventional jet fuel is 89 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of jet fuel produced and used in an aircraft. And that's the first line here. LCAF is basically a fuel which is also a conventional jet fuel. However, as you can see from the different stages, the carbon intensity of each of these stages, specifically the feedstock and the processing, because distribution and combustion are pretty much hardwired within the original LCA of the jet fuel. But we have a lot of space to reduce our emissions from the refining and from the crude oil production and the crude oil transportation components of the life cycle. If we do that and achieve at minimum a 10% reduction from the baseline, so any conventional jet fuel that has a carbon intensity of 80 grams per megajoule or below qualifies as a lower carbon aviation fuel. Now we can see, of course, in comparison, sustainable aviation fuel such as HEFA has way much or larger margins when it comes to life cycle emissions reductions. Also, maybe synthetic electrofuels that are produced from renewable energy also would have a significantly higher or larger emission reduction margin compared to lower carbon aviation fuels. So why LCAF is important? Because sustainable aviation fuels such as HEFA and e-fuels, which is e-fuel is considered more of a long-term sustainable aviation fuel and not really within the medium term of 2020 to 2035 timeframe. Why LCAF is important? Because LCAF works on the volume and not on the margin. As you can see, we are constrained by 74 grams per megajoule only from the combustion stage of the life cycle, and therefore the margin is not what creates the share of LCAF into the market. It's basically the volume, because you can see that LCAF or conventional jet fuels, even with the CORSIA projections, will continue to play the majority of the market by volume. Whereas SAF or sustainable aviation fuels, they work on the margin and not by the volume due to the economic constraints of the SAF penetration into the aviation industry. Therefore, the way we look at it is that LCAF would provide basically it capitalizes on our regional existing infrastructure, the oil and gas infrastructure, which is a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure, and it aligns with our sustainability initiatives within the region to produce LCAF. And given the significant volume of conventional jet fuel being consumed, we will be able to create, or we have a potential as a oil-rich region to be able to produce a eligible fuel for the CORSIA with a significant impact, while complementing the development of sustainable aviation fuels, which is, as I said, work more on the emission reduction margins. However, would be expected to be more economically, less economic compared to LCAF, given the fact that we need to develop more infrastructure or new infrastructure for this type of fuel. So I can talk more, of course, if we have the chance, and if you have any questions about how do we view the potential of LCAF and what are the technologies that we look at for LCAF production. But basically, I wanted to use this couple of slides to introduce the concept. What do we mean by lower carbon aviation fuel, and how does this compare to the other options available under CORSIA, such as the offsetting and the sustainable aviation fuels?
Not in September.
And I guess that's it. That's my very short presentation. I didn't want to I will leave more for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hassan. I think you laid out a clear introduction to what lower carbon aviation fuels are. And without a doubt, we would like to delve in a little bit deeper, specifically into this idea of what are the technologies that would enable lower carbon aviation fuels in the production process, because I think that is a very important topic. But before we do that, let's go ahead and continue with the presentations. And so next in the docket we have Martin Rothbart. Martin is the Senior Product Manager. And can I ask you, Hassan, to close your microphone? I think there's a significant amount of noise. Thank you. Sorry. So next we have Martin Rothbart. Martin is Senior Product Manager in Energy and Sustainability for the Global Business Development Group at AVL List GmbH in Austria. And Martin will be talking to us about this concept of e-fuels that Hassan has just mentioned, and we have been mentioning throughout the different sessions we've had in this webinar series. But Martin will give us a very clear idea about what these fuels are and how they come to fruition. So Martin, please, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. Let me share my screen. So, okay. So synthetic fuels and how can they help in the aviation? Let's start with a quick intro about our company. So we are an Austrian based company in Europe, founded in 1948, and we are basically grew out of the automotive business, and with the increasing in the connection to the energy world, we are now more and more also developing into the energy world and energy production, right? So after that, let's quickly jump into a slide I put together on the local situation of UAE. And putting that data together and doing the research for that, I really was impressed, and I'm still impressed.
Sorry, Martin, I think we lost you for a couple of minutes, but that's fine. You're back. Thank you.
Okay. So I was really impressed when seeing all the numbers on solar energy and the potential of UAE. On the very left-hand side, you see the kilowatt hour per kilowatt peak solar map for Germany. And on the right-hand side, you see the same for UAE. And the thing which impressed me the most is that when you look at the scale, and hopefully that's big enough for that you to see. So where the scale ends for Germany, and that's the same thing for whole Central Europe, the upper scale end is not even the point where the scale starts. The lower scale starts for the UAE. So the potential is really huge, and you know that numbers took out of a number from the news on one recent announcement of a new PV project in Dubai, where the projected levelized cost of electricity will be $7 per megawatt hour, which is really incredible. So on this side, so on the electricity side and the electricity prices, it's really a great basis we have here in UAE. The challenge we have with renewables, and that's true for the whole world and not only for that region, is that we have intermittency, so variability of the renewable energy. So I put here a time-based plot of PV park somewhere in Germany, and we see during the night we have no sun shining, and so we have no production of electricity. Same is true for the wind. In this case, on a 7-day basis, so we have fluctuations in the intensity the wind is blowing here in Central Europe. And solar park, again, at least here in Europe, we also have seasonal changes, seasonal intermittency with the intensity, the sun is shining, and the weather conditions. So we need to store that energy somehow, whether for a short term on a decentral basis in batteries, for example, or on long term in mechanical or chemical storages. When I talk about chemical storages, then I'm talking about a conversion to hydrogen or hydrogen plus conversion to synthetic fuels. And taking a look to the future, just a rough roadmap in here. As already said before from one of the other speakers, is that we have a future getting more green and having a hopefully towards CO2-free mobility. And for the different types and variations of mobility, we see the different pathways: direct green electricity, synthetic fuels, or green hydrogen. And there is a race, at least for the on-road transportation, for on-road mobility, between these three energy carriers. But for the long distance transport and travel, like starting with commercial on-road vehicles, aviation, marine, it's clear that we need chemical energy carriers like the synthetic fuel. And so it might be a transition fuel in on-road mobility. For the long distance travel and long distance mobility, it's for sure here to stay to help to reduce the CO2 footprint of those areas. Now, getting in a little bit more technical, I brought with me a picture. What is needed to produce such a synthetic fuel, and what do we want to get at the end? We want to have at the end 1 liter of synthetic fuel. In this case, Fischer-Tropsch diesel, but that's similar for other routes. So what we can see here, we have different production methods. So we have certain ranges. We need about 5 liters of water as an input. We need about 25 kilowatt hours of electricity for the production of 1 liter synthetic fuel. And depending on your carbon source, on your CO2 source, whether it's available as a direct source, or you want to do direct air capture, which is very prominent here in Europe as a future solution. You need additional energy for that as well. So what we can see, this is quite a huge number of inputs of energy needed for this 1 liter. 1 liter is quite fine, but what do we need to scale that up? I tried to scale that up and have a relation to the UAE. So as an example, you might be aware of one of the biggest synthetic fuel plants we have available. This is the Shell plant in Qatar. They are doing gas to liquid, so it's not really fully renewable, but in terms of processing, it's the closest thing we have on a large scale. So in that plant, to produce 2.8 million tons of fuel, they need 100 terawatt hours, 14 million tons of water, and that covers an area of 7 square kilometers. Converting that, and I tried to pick up a number, we can discuss later if I picked up the right numbers or not. I found the number that UAE is producing close to 13 million tons of jet fuel and aviation fuel, I mean. And to scale it up, that would need about 460 terawatt hours of energy, 65 million tons of water, and covers the appropriate area to that. And that's compared to the numbers we have in UAE, at least for the energy. That's the issue. That's 4 times the electricity consumption we have right now in UAE. So for sure, to have a 100% solution, not only drop-in, there needs some things to do and some things to develop. But for sure, we also need to think of starting on a lower scale, because just stepping back and saying, okay, that will never happen, that will never take place, does not bring us to the target of 0 CO2 levels. So what we did is saying, okay, let's start on a decentralized basis, start with small containerized systems where we have an electrolyzing system, where we have in the first step producing hydrogen, and then in a second step producing the synthetic fuel. The local requirements here is we need electricity, we need CO2 as an input, water, and we need to storage and the distribution logistic. And here on the electrolysis side, we are using here high temperature electrolysis, which has some way to go in terms of maturity, and the other section like the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis needs some upscaling. This is the main target at the end. But we start here on the small scale to have at least some impact in here. We also took a look to the costs, of the production of the synthetic fuels. And so we came up with a kind of matrix where we have the electricity price as an input and the full load hours. And resulting of that, different cost levels, cost ranges for producing that synthetic fuel in this containerized system. So looking here into it, this is somewhere the range where we can get with European conditions in terms of electricity prices and full load hours. And key drivers for everything is the efficiency, the price, and the full load hours. And bringing back the picture of the solar PV park we had at the beginning. So converting the $17 per megawatt hour into euro cent per kilowatt hour, UAE has here a perfect starting point. So we are almost at the very low end of the scale in terms of electricity price. We need to discuss how much full load hours we can realize with sun only, or do we need additional electricity sources from other sources. So with that, to sum it up, on technology side, we need to do an optimization. There still need to be an optimization to be done for hydrogen electrolysis, including the storage, in order to bring the costs down further. And we highly believe in the electrolyzer technology on high temperature electrolysis, which shows a very high efficiency compared to the other technologies, but it's still in an R&D phase, and we need to increase the durability of that system. In the production, synthetic fuel adds one optimal route for CO2 emission reductions, and we can combine that fuel in the combination with the hydrogen electrolysis and using CO2 capture from any source and the Fischer-Tropsch process of fuel production. We should start decentralized to start somewhere on a small scale. Main target at the end should be a centralized upscaled system. And as UAE has a very good position, locations with lower electricity price are preferred to get to a lower production price and to be at the end really cost competitive to the fossil counterparts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Very interesting presentation. I think you've laid out the conditions and more specifically the opportunities we have here in the UAE for the production of these e-fuels. Because as you pointed out, we have a number of conditions in that list that you presented. A number of conditions are already here. And so I know it's very clear that we need to have many other factors to take into account, and hopefully we can address some of these questions during our discussion. So thank you very much, Martin. And so now we will move ahead and to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. Faye Al-Hirsch. She is a technology specialist for the strategy division at Masdar. Masdar is Abu Dhabi, the Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company here in the United Arab Emirates. And so please, Faye, can you go ahead and share with us your presentation? Thank you.
Sure. Let me just try to share the presentation. Sorry, for some reason, the PowerPoint presentation does not really appear. Maybe I can share my entire screen.
If you have issues, maybe I can go ahead and share the screen and you can just tell me when to switch the...
Sure, can you not see my screen right now?
I can't see it.
Okay, so then I think it would be best if you share the presentation from your side and I can ask you to move from slide to slide.
Okay, so I think it
that.
is now. So please just let me know when you need me to change the slide.
Sure. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting Masdar to participate and be part of this discussion. We can move into the next slide. Great. So I'd like to start this presentation by giving a brief overview of Masdar, who we...
Okay. I think we lost Faye for some reason.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so Masdar's journey began in 2006 when it was established with a mission to help maintain the UAE's leadership in the global energy sector while supporting the diversification of its economy and energy sources for the benefit of future generations. So Masdar is keen to make Abu Dhabi the benchmark for knowledge and collaboration in the advancement of renewable energy, clean technologies, and sustainable development. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so Masdar now has more than a decade of experience as a renewable energy developer and investor, working in partnership with businesses and the government. We invest in and contribute to innovative global projects, including large utility-scale renewable energy power plants, as well as community grid projects. So Masdar now has 10 gigawatts of renewables in operation or under development, with project value exceeding $15 billion US. We can move into the next slide, please. Okay, so Masdar is now active in more than 30 countries around the world and are one of the largest developers of renewable energy projects in the Middle East. Next slide, please. In the slide, we can see the projects that are specific to the UAE. Next slide, sorry. Okay, so our Masdar city development is one of the world's most sustainable cities and has one of the world's largest clusters of LEED Platinum certified buildings in the world. LEED, of course, is the world's leading green building rating system. So approximately 90% of the construction waste in Masdar city is reused or recycled. And the buildings in the city are at least 40% more energy and water efficient than conventional city buildings in Abu Dhabi. And the city is partly powered by a 10 megawatt solar PV farm, as well as the 1 megawatt rooftop solar panels. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think we are you back?
Sorry. Connection issues. I'll continue on. So we recognize that there is now a global momentum to switch from conventional fossil fuels to sustainable fuels. It is uncertain if the current demand for the non-decarbonized fossil fuels will remain, as new policies and regulations in support of sustainable fuels are being introduced in many countries around the world, such as the EU. So the prices of the fossil fuels may continue to fall in the future, but a new market will develop for sustainable fuels. So as part, going back to the previous slide, as part of the energy transition to achieve efficient decarbonization, we believe that green hydrogen is expected to play a significant role because it is able to decarbonize sectors where it is difficult to meaningfully reduce the CO2 emissions. And the UAE is uniquely positioned to produce green hydrogen due to the low-cost solar resources and the abundant space. Also, significant advances have been made in improving the efficiency of electrolyzers and reducing their costs. So the UAE can also capitalize on its existing infrastructure. It has the relevant domestic off-takers such as Etihad and Emirates, and is considered as a reliable, politically stable offtake partner to many offtake countries and companies around the world, especially in Europe and in Asia, allowing it to potentially export these sustainable fuels. So we can move now to the next slide. So as you're probably aware, green hydrogen is hydrogen that is produced by electrolysis, which is powered by electricity from renewable energy sources. So this generated green hydrogen, together with captured CO2, can be then converted to aviation fuels, include sustainable fuels such as synthetic kerosene. So we realize currently that the price of green hydrogen cannot compete with its alternatives, but this is expected to change with coordinated industry actions to achieve scale-up and further cost reductions, in addition to the introduction of targets and national policies that will facilitate the inevitable transition and the growth in demand. So next slide, please. Okay, so currently the aviation sector contributes to around 2.8% of the global anthropogenic CO2 emissions, and the emissions are expected to increase by 3 to 5% in the coming years. So although although the aviation sector is not part of the Paris Agreement, it has still committed itself to a 50% reduction from the 2005 levels by 2050. And we believe that this would only be possible with a transition or a shift towards sustainable aviation fuels. So given that the UAE is a major player in the world aviation, it is in prime position to be a worldwide leader in the abatement of aviation emissions. Next slide, please. So there are currently many global initiatives on sustainable aviation fuels. And just to give an example of one, so we have the Westküste project in Germany, which is divided into two stages. So the first stage involves a 30 megawatt electrolyzer capacity by 2025 that will produce green hydrogen for oil refinery at site. And then the second stage would involve a scale up to 700 megawatt electrolyzer capacity for the production of carbon neutral synthetic kerosene. So I won't be going into any more details, but there are more examples of such initiatives in Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Canada. So we can now skip to slide 17, please. Yeah. Great. So such demonstration or pilot projects at this stage would help build key competencies and gain in-house knowledge, increase the number of skilled and professionals in the sustainable, in the hydrogen and sustainable fuel industry. It will also help form key partnerships and understand projected demand while anticipating the potential introduction of policies in support of sustainable hydrogen and fuels. And we believe that the aviation sector represents.
Sorry, it seems as if we have lost Faye once again.
Sorry about that.
Okay, you're back.
So I'm just going to end the presentation right now. So it represents one of the best use case applications for green hydrogen in the medium and the long term that would result in significant emission reductions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye. I think it's all very clear, and it's good to know that Masdar has this on their radar. It's very important that companies that have the capacity to develop large-scale projects, such as the portfolio that Masdar already has under its wing, are considering these types of projects, because we think that this is a must so that this can develop here in the UAE. With that, we'll go ahead and move to our last panelist. Adrian Gain is the Director for Industry and International Affairs at the Etihad Aviation Group here in the UAE. Adrian will not be sharing slides with us, but he has ample experience in the aviation industry, and clearly, because we are talking about sustainable aviation fuels, it is always important to bring us back to the vision and the understanding that the aviation industry has. And so with that, Adrian, I'll give you the floor for your intervention, and then we can move on to our discussion. Thank you, Adrian.
Great, thank you, Alejandro, and good afternoon, everybody. Very great privilege to be on the panel with my distinguished speakers. What I'm going to do is just talk about the background to aviation, and Alejandro asked me to concentrate on the vision for the UAE because we're a fairly major player in aviation, and I guess what we would do would be applicable to other big aviation players, and so shape the industry. So looking at that, UAE aviation is a big part of the UAE economy, and it's a big part of international aviation. Just to give you some statistics, the UAE is the third largest provider of capacity in the world if you measure it by revenue ton kilometers. That's the amount of seats, miles that we put on. If you think about Emirates, Etihad, Fly Dubai, we've got a lot of capacity, long haul routes. Because of that, we're a very high fuel consumption country. We're about number 15 in the world, which is surprising when you think of other big high domestic markets. But against that, we're 20% of GDP, so it's a big chunk of what the UAE does economically. Hundreds of thousands of jobs depend on it. And it's, as everybody knows, it's a crossroads for the world. It's a big deal. So how do we pivot ourselves, looking forward to what people are now calling the green recovery after COVID, how do we get ready? And I would stress, obviously, the statistics I'm giving were pre-COVID. I am sure that there will be a sharp rebound once we have vaccines and people get back to traveling. The statistics, the growth, the charts that you see about aviation, I'm sure they will pick up, albeit with a 2 or 3 year dip. So this is a problem we have to address now. We can't forget about it. The downside is for us is that we are UAE is the 6th highest producer of CO2 in the world in terms of aviation production. We can't, I mean, apart from traditional hydrocarbon stocks, if we were to take all the non-solar feedstock routes like halophytes, vegetable oil, domestic waste, all those sorts of things, at best case, and I think Khalifa University have done the sums on this, we would probably only produce 5% of our domestic requirement by 2030, which is not enough. And some of those feedstocks would need a large amount of land to produce a huge amount. It's not to say we shouldn't keep trying, but there's no silver bullet. We've got to try lots of different things. And in any case, currently with current technology, you can only put 50% of the SAFs into our fuel tanks. Now that may increase theoretically. I think we can do 100%, but there's a way to go yet. So what are we Etihad doing about it? Well, clearly we're signed up to CORSIA, and you heard the presentations earlier from the others about the commitment to reduce the CO2 emissions. Now those are largely operational and offsets, and there's a lot of talk about offsets and how robust they are. There's a lot of argument and debate about them, and maybe come back to that, and we can perhaps talk about them in the questions. But Etihad has gone further than the industry commitment. We are committing to 0 carbon by 2050. So we're ahead of the industry in that regard. We've committed to 50% of last year's CO2 emissions by 2030. So that's quite ambitious. There's probably only a few airlines in the world that have committed to that. We're the only one in the Middle East that has committed to that. But that is in line with the way big economic blocks are going. Like the EU is looking at a 2030 target. Other countries are now beginning to produce national targets. So I think as an industry, every industry is going to have to up its game a bit as we go through the next 5 years. How will we do that? Well, currently, operational improvements are one part of it. You know, more direct routing, better air traffic control, better use of technology. Our new 787 Greenliners are a massive improvement over what we had with an A340 maybe 5-6 years ago. I mean, it was like 50% increase in fuel efficiency. So that's one part. We will obviously be using whatever sustainable aviation fuels we can get, but equally, we will in the short term be doing offsets. And we're looking at a program at the moment, which we hope to announce soon. And offsets, they've got a bit of a dirty reputation, as I said earlier, but actually if they're properly done and they are new programs which otherwise wouldn't have occurred, I think they are completely defensible until we get something in the long run. And actually there's a big biodiversity benefit. So that's a bit of the background. Clearly we can't move to SAFs at the moment. They're very expensive and there's not much around. I mean, if we could fill the tanks tomorrow, we would, but we can't pick it up anywhere. So the UAE, in my view, moving forward now, looking at the vision, is in an incredibly good place to lead the industry, lead the world indeed, in terms of CO2 negative production. And the reasons for that are a number. One is we have a very big strategic industry. Secondly, we have a state that's very well adept at taking on big projects and coordinating business and government together. And I think that's a great testament to what's been achieved here in the last 50 years. But I think, crucially, we will have to embrace new technology. And I think coming on to the theme of this seminar, in terms of having an institute for sustainable aviation fuels, we need a body which can oversee and champion the best technologies, which will give us the chance to achieve those 0 targets. Now, I think the talks that we've had from Hassan and John and Martin are fascinating in terms of what solar power can do. I think that's the first time I've seen the estimate of what territory would be required from Martin in terms of producing that oil, 8 times the size of Dubai. It's quite frightening, actually. But I think if you think about it, the technology, the type of aircraft we use, I'm sure we will improve on that as years go by. So I think the solar route is a very exciting way in terms of producing hydrogen drop-in fuel and indeed hydrogen engines. So let's then look at the technology for the aircraft themselves. We're currently looking at engine technology, which is quite old, albeit they're very efficient now. What are we going to have in another 10 years' time? Well, for short-haul routes, I think there's no doubt about it, in places like Europe, electrical aircraft will be operating. They're not really appropriate for the sorts of distances that we have in this part of the world. So it's going to have to be a mixture of new technology and sustainable fuels. But really, if we could get to a position where every time you took a flight, you were taking CO2 out of the atmosphere as opposed to putting it in, wouldn't that be a great thing? And I think that's perfectly achievable. And I think it's an industry, if you think about aviation, where it's come from, in 1910, the Wright brothers didn't think they were going to be serving coffee and taking people's bags. Now look where it is now. And I think in another 20, 30 years, with technological change, we've got every chance of hitting those targets. And I think a SAFI institute to help us do that in the UAE and elsewhere in other key aviation markets is a great way to go. So Alejandro, I'll stop there perhaps in the interest of time, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you for giving us that perspective. I think it's important. Indeed, this is why we're all looking to establish this initiative, this Sustainable Aviation Fuel Initiative for the UAE, and hopefully we'll be able to do that in the near future. And so with that, I'd like to open or invite our panelists back into the conversation, because we would like to start delving into some of these very interesting and important issues that have been raised by each of you. And we'll start this off by asking a couple of questions. And so for one of the questions, since Martin, you're right here in the screen, one of the things that caught my eye when you gave your presentation was this land requirement. So I just wanted to ask you if you can give us a little bit more information about what that entails, or because obviously you need some, if you're going to be producing renewable electricity using solar PV, you're going to need land to do that. I don't know if that land was included in your land estimate or not, or was that just for the specific, gas to liquid component of it? And so can you please clarify that a little bit? Yeah, I took the number. It's only the production. So it's the gas to liquid plant of Shell in Qatar. So it's not including the renewable energy production of that. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, in the next 5 to 10 years, if we see emerging technologies which can lower the footprint of such productions, like I pointed out on a small scale with the high temperature electrolysis, which has a quite high efficiency. So that is, we need to see what things to come. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I'd like to go back to one of the issues that were raised by Hassan. Hassan, you said that we would like to, the very big question here is how do we develop or how do we go about producing lower carbon aviation fuels? And so there are a number of technologies that are important in order for us to be able to do that. And so can you please try to go a little bit into this, into these technologies, and explain how they would play a role in the production of lower carbon aviation fuels, or in reducing the carbon intensity of the fuels that we already produce from conventional fossil based sources?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, as I said during my presentation, the production of LCAF is very well aligned with our regional sustainability initiatives within the oil and gas industry. So the production of jet fuel entails a lot of stages throughout the supply chain. This includes the production of the oil, the transportation of the oil and the shipping, the refining stage, which are the three stages that I would say are the target for emissions reduction. So technologies, as part of our work underneath the fuel technical group, which is under CAPE, we have identified so far, at least initially for the discussion, 6 technologies. Among these, of course, it's no surprise to anyone in the oil and gas industry that we target in the region zero routine flaring, which is flaring is the means of disposing a gas that has no market. This is one of the major sources of CO2 emissions on the upstream part of oil production. Therefore, reducing the eliminating routine flaring is one of the main practices which requires developing natural gas infrastructure or gas pipelines infrastructure and gas processing plants to enable the utilization of this basically otherwise flared gas source. Another also very important source of emissions are the methane. You know, like methane is a very potent greenhouse gas compared to CO2, and targeting minimization of fugitives and methane leakage from the oil and gas infrastructure is a very important also practice, which requires also technology like leak detection technology and control systems. In addition to these two, I would recall in the upstream, of course, here I'm talking mainly about maybe UAE type of oil, Saudi Arabia type of oil, which is around light, medium type of oil. Not our, you know, in the region we have also other types of oil that would have a potential for other types of technology like renewable integration upstream, etc. In the midstream, of course, we target, which is the refining part, we target main sources of emissions in the refineries that particularly affect the carbon intensity of jet fuels. I mean, you know, refinery not only produces jet fuel, it produces a set of series of products. And among the, I mean, when we look at what makes a jet fuel, a conventional jet fuel, it's mainly kerosene. And this kerosene can be a straight run kerosene from the distillation column, can be from the hydrocracker units, and can be also hydrotreated from a hydrotreater, so we get hydrotreated kerosene. So it's a mix. It's a mix of all of these three, mainly a mix of these three components. Therefore, when we want to reduce the emissions of jet fuel, we target the emissions of the distillation column, where a big portion of the kerosene that we use to make jet fuel actually comes right away from the distillation column. Therefore, technologies that would, let's say, increasing the oxygen content of the furnaces, electrifying the heaters, and using renewable energy on the distillation columns, and other type of technologies, like, for example, increasing the hydrogen content of the fuel gas that's being used in the furnaces, etc., can play a major role in tackling the carbon intensity. In addition, of course, if we have hydrotreated components or kerosene from hydrocrackers, like we look at the hydrogen production, which can be, we can use green hydrogen as a source of hydrogen for the hydrocrackers and for the basically hydrotreaters, or also we can use carbon capture and storage integration or kind of retrofitting carbon capture and storage technology to the steam method reformers. So, I mean, these are the basically the collection, I would say, of technologies that I see are most impactful across the jet fuel supply chain to be able to achieve a life cycle emissions intensity that is at least 10% lower than the baseline, which is the conventional jet fuel today.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting and very important. You know, perhaps we should have an entire session on LCAF because, you know, just by looking at each and every one of those technologies and how they influence the carbon intensity of jet fuel is extremely interesting to understand in more detail. However, I'd like to, you know, sort of shift gears here a little bit and ask both John and Faye to chime in on this idea of, you know, John mentioned very interesting elements that are needed in order to be able to build these large scale projects, and you mentioned the share of participation. These are in essence private public partnerships that are developing these projects, and I think that and you mentioned a number of elements such as modularity, and you're targeting a number of other things. There's also been a number of announcements recently in terms of developing waste to energy projects. And so, you know, I know that Masdar has one waste to energy project in Sharjah. And so can you give us a little sense of how these waste to energy projects are being conceptualized, and you know, what is the main motivation behind the development of these projects? And perhaps John, you can go first, and then we can have Faye also contribute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
I forgot about that. I beg your pardon. Right, there we go. So yes, waste to energy in the region, there's been a few successful ones, which Masdar and Faye can talk a bit more of how the Sharjah project was set up. But now EWEC, we've set ourselves up to launch two waste to energy projects in Abu Dhabi now. One to serve the needs of Abu Dhabi and one for Al Ain, producing about 90 megawatts of electricity and 60 megawatts respectively. And the key issues is that the regulatory process here governing the key aspect of the project is the waste itself. And at the moment, you know, because we have so much land, the use of landfill to deal with our waste is not considered of any economic value. So what we've been doing, and we've tried to launch waste to energy over the last 6-7 years, but what we've not focused on is to formulate that regulatory process. So we're talking very closely with the Department of Environment, because we know straight away that ourselves as trying to achieve lowest cost of electricity would not be able to support the project because it does need subsidy at the moment. But what we've done is proposed a solution to the Department of Energy, so to satisfy their requirements, and a white paper has been drafted and is going through the process at the moment. So we intend to launch a process that uses again our strengths over the last 12 IWPPs that we've done over the last 20 years as well, to then put a tariff on the energy and then get a bid for the gate fee, essentially, for the waste. And we hope that will be successful and start a fair and transparent process again, while satisfying the regulatory, making it very transparent where subsidy lies.
I think that's incredibly interesting, because you very well you know, highlighted an issue here that has to do with public policy that would enable these types of projects. And it's true, you know, in this region of the world, or at least at very least here in the UAE, we don't know about these feed-in tariffs or these, tariffs that would enable the managing of the waste or the disposal of the waste. And so I think that that's an incredibly important contribution. Can you tell us, as a ballpark figure, what is the expected cost of the energy that would be produced from these waste energy projects, or is it too early to tell?
It's a bit too early to say at the moment, Alejandro.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Faye, can you give us a little bit on your opinion from Masdar's perspective on this?
Sure, I can maybe start by giving you a bit of more information about the project that we have. So in 2017, Masdar signed a joint development agreement with BIA of Sharjah to develop the UAE's first waste-to-energy power plant. So on completion, the plant will divert more than 300,000 tons of solid waste from landfill each year and displaces almost 400,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year, while producing 240,000 megawatt hours of clean energy. So this was part of helping the UAE to achieve its 2021 goal of diverting 75% of its solid waste from landfill sites. And we have another project as well in Australia, and we're hoping to as well include more of these projects in our scope in the future as well. So John mentioned this as well, and the thing is, the same applies with any new technologies in the region. There are certain things that would help facilitate the development of these projects, be it in the UAE or different regions, and one of them is policy. So at the initial stage, be it the waste-to-energy route, or even in the medium term, it would be appealing to go towards the route of waste-to-even fuel. Certain introductions of policies or regulations will be needed at the initial stage to speed up that transition period. So initially it could be in the form of like a part of a framework or agreement as part of the strategy, or on the form of a regulations or monetary supports through funds or subsidies, and or then through targets.
Okay, I think we lost Faye here for a minute again. Okay. Sorry, you're back.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want.
I was just going through targets that would help facilitate that transition to scale up later on and make it more economically viable.
Okay. Thank you very much, Faye. I think that one of the I guess topics that has been floating around in each of these interventions is, and going back to what the strategy for Etihad or for the aviation industry in this country will be moving forward, since there is no available sustainable aviation fuel at this time, is to do carbon offsetting. And so there has been a number of questions as to, where will Etihad or Emirates, or where will the aviation industry from this country go out and buy these offset credits to be able to participate in CORSIA. And so I don't know, Adrian, if you can start us off in this discussion, but I'd like each and every one to chime in on this carbon offsetting, because each of these projects that we have been talking about, the development of clean and renewable energy projects, would be in a sense a source of carbon credits for the industry. And so I don't know if you can start us off, Adrian, and perhaps we can then ask each of our panelists to give their take on what would these projects be able to produce in terms of offsetting. Because ideally, from a general perspective, it would be ideal for Etihad to be able to buy its carbon or its emissions units certifications from local projects, and not to go out and buy some certificates of emissions units from the Amazon. Nothing wrong with going out and doing that, but if there are locally available certificates of emissions units, it'd be ideal. And so perhaps, Adrian, if you can start us off on this particular topic.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we started looking at this about a year ago, and we, before we knew much about it, we took the view that we've got to sell this to our passengers, our customers, and unless it's really sort of easy to understand that we've made a difference in terms of buying these offsets, it wouldn't be worth doing. So we will only buy offsets if they make a quantifiable additional difference to carbon capture. So if we hadn't done the project, that carbon capture wouldn't have occurred. Now, if you look into the carbon offset market, there are lots of old schemes. So there'll be chunks of forest in Madagascar. You can buy a bit of that forest, but maybe someone had it before you. So intellectually, that doesn't sound very rigorous that you're cycling stuff that would have been there anyway. Now, rather helpfully, ICAO, with the assistance of our own GCAA, have been doing a lot of work on this, and they've now established very stringent standards as to what's acceptable for the CORSIA offset scheme. And there are about 4 or 5 standards which have been accepted. So if you go to the market today, most carbon trading markets are in Singapore, New York, and London. There's not much expertise here in the Middle East, which is something that is being addressed by ADGM, which is the Abu Dhabi global market. So that's quite exciting for us. But you're right. I think as a UAE Abu Dhabi carrier, we would like to be able to have CO2 offset projects here in the UAE, but it's sadly that they aren't there. So currently, you'd have to go to traditional places like South America, Africa, and Asia. But you're right, Orlando. I think there's a very exciting potential for new projects. So, for instance, the halophyte program, which you yourself have done for the seawater tolerant plants, that can have a biodiversity impact. It certainly has a CO2 impact. And those could be things with mangrove swamps that could be planted in the UAE. It would make a huge difference and would be very, very marketable. And it's very interesting, if you look in Europe, a lot of Europe's now moving to a green agricultural policy. They're not looking to incentivize food production. They're looking to incentivize farmers for their environmental benefits. Now, you can argue whether that's sensible or not in terms of food security, but there are a lot of sheep farmers who'd be very grateful for that because they can't make money out of their sheep, but they can make money out of safeguarding the land and making sure that it has all the environmental products that society wants to see. So the big potential for that, I think that's the next big wave. I think if it's done properly, I think it can be a very good thing in the toolbox. It's not a silver bullet, as I said earlier. It's got to be a combination of things. But we're certainly continuing to look, and we will be rolling out that program next year.
Thank you, Adrian. John, can you help us understand if these carbon offsetting is at all part of EWEC's portfolio of alternatives, or is this something that's being considered at all?
It's something that's started to be considered. We've not done so much so far, but we intend to delve into that a lot more, especially as we increase our PV solar content and also the waste to energy projects, because it does have a significant support specifically to the project as well. So, you know, in effect, it can support the development of our other initiatives alongside you, and with say the hydrogen initiative that we're looking at as well. So okay. that is all part of the overall equation to solve to move on. So
okay, thank you.
We're looking at it already, but not formalized anything yet. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Faye, do you have anything to add to this?
Sure. I could just say that we think this is a good starting point, but it would only be.
Sorry, I think we lost you again. Sorry. So we'll.
Sorry.
You're back.
This is probably more frustrating for me than it is for anyone else. But as I was saying, this would be only limited to the transition period. We think that later on we would have to look into more, for example, introducing higher blending mandates that would incorporate greener or cleaner solutions in order to meet the, I would say, stringent regulations that are anticipated by the aviation sector.
Okay, thank you. Hassan, you have a lot of experience in the fuel task group and everything that is going on there, and with the development of CORSIA. What is your view on these projects, specifically maybe from Saudi Aramco, that are being developed, and how is the carbon offsetting strategy being put together from your perspective? You're mute.
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, I'm on mute. So thank you, Adrian. I mean, as I mentioned, of course, at the beginning of the presentation, that one of the most important things about CORSIA is basically that the carbon offsetting lies at the heart of it. So we do, of course, know that the ultimate goal is basically to create high quality carbon offsets that would enable us to specifically decarbonize hard to decarbonize sectors such as aviation and other sectors. And we actually envision such a concept not only to be applied to aviation, but this is very much important for the whole transport sector, and not only a specific subsector of the transport sector. And therefore, in the future, we look for the development or the advancement of technologies such as direct air capture technologies. I mean, one of the most important characteristics of such a technology, although it's a long term, there's a long way to bring the cost down to be competitive. But from a technology concept point of view, one of the very interesting and exciting facts about this technology is its ability to produce easily quantifiable and high quality types of offsets, because the quality of the offsets is one of the main concerns or the main basically constraints that are holding basically the mass adoption of such a source of or mechanism for emissions reductions. So we do endorse the importance, and we look for nature-based solutions, of course, on the short to medium term, and for the advancement of game-changing technologies such as direct air capture on the long term.
Okay.
So that's what it is.
Thank you very much, Hassan. And Martin, in Europe, there's been a significant amount of consideration to this, and so I don't know if you can give us your view on how e-fuels can participate in creating carbon offsetting emissions units, and any thinking that has been going on in Europe around these lines.
Right. Thank you. The thoughts going through my mind when listening to the other panelists is an issue in Europe, which is discussed a lot, is who is really benefiting from the reduction of CO2, of the carbon. So when thinking about creating or producing synthetic fuel using concentrated carbon sources from industry, who will at the end be having the benefit of CO2 reduction? Is it the industry, producing the CO2 and not putting it up to the air, or is it the fuel producer, or is it at the end the user, whether it is aviation or transport, who is benefiting from the CO2 reduction? So that is still a discussion ongoing, and that's why I also in favor or not in favor of direct air capture, because then it's quite clear it's coming out of the air, and it's the point where you collect the CO2, you can account the reduction for it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. As you've seen, we are running out of time. We've run out of time already. But, I don't want to close the session without having a very short, I guess, closing sentence from each of you. You know that we're trying to put forward the idea of this sustainable aviation fuel initiative for the UAE. And so if I can have a very short closing thought from each of you, in terms of, within your perspectives, how you see the future of sustainable aviation fuels developing in the UAE, in the world. And so perhaps we can start with John and go along the same order that we started. So John, can you please just start us off with your closing thoughts, please?
Thanks, Alejandro. Closing thoughts is that there should be significant potential of being able to make this commercially viable. And, we have the land area, we have high solar potential to support the production of synthetic fuels. So we'll be very interested to continue and support this initiative as it develops.
Thank you very much, John. If we can go next to Hassan, please. Hassan.
Yeah, thanks, Alejandro. Yeah, I mean, my closing comments would be highlighting the importance actually of when looking at a holistic solution for the decarbonization of the aviation industry, whether the target is CORSIA or whether the target is even to exceed CORSIA. In fact, what's really important, I think, is to look at the economic, how much is the options that you are putting in place economically sensible. So there is a sequence, in my opinion, that we should take in achieving our decarbonization targets, and this sequence needs to take into account the abatement cost curve, in other words.
Yeah.
And by doing that, we will be looking at solving the problem from the eye of the operator. I always, as you said, given our experience working in the fuel technical group, I always stress on the importance of, when looking at this as a solution, not to look at it from the producer point of view, but to look at it from the operator point of view, because operators are very sensitive to fuel prices. We need to always remember that. And therefore, we need to work on the technologies that are most effective in bringing this supply or abatement curve down to be economically sensible from an operator point of view. So we need to rank them. We need to have a proper economic sense when it comes to operating an airline in the region.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Martin, can you give us your closing thoughts, please?
Sure. What I think is we need to, so I think I see a clear future for that. And what I think is we need to do it step by step and not waiting for a 100% solution, and moving forward to a net zero CO2 emission goal.
Thank you, Martin. Faye?
Yes, so we think that we got to a stage where we can no longer ignore the environmental impact of the sector, and a single industry cannot achieve this alone, and in the same way, a single country cannot achieve this alone. So we need a structured, cohesive approach that combines the relevant airports, airlines, and countries, which is why initiatives such as SAFI on a global scale is ideal to bring the relevant entities while enforcing some milestones and targets to make this possible.
Thank you very much, Faye. And Adrian, you have the last word, I guess.
The last word, right. Well, no, I totally agree with everything said. This is critical. We have to get it right. And as Faye says, this is a sector issue, and we've all got to work, government, private sector, and indeed the traveling public. We all have to be part of it. This is a global challenge. And if we don't get it right now, we won't be forgiven.
Okay, thank you very much. I thank each and every one of you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Faye. And thank you, Adrian. Thank you very much for your participation. I'd like to remind everyone that we will have our next session, session 7, next Tuesday. And so we look forward to seeing you then. It will be at 4 p.m. UAE time. And so I hope that you can join us then. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you to our sponsors. and we look forward to seeing you in our next session. Thank you.
Thank you.